Research is the number one way that we find out new things about the world. I think it's pretty hard to overstate its importance. Nearly everything that we have today at some point would have been the outcome of a research project. That could be something like GPS, it could be gene editing treatments, it could be self-driving or electric cars. All of these things are research projects that have been brought to life through science. Given all of the excellence of that work and given all of those discoveries and boundless opportunities that have been given to us by that science, does that mean then that we should trust science? Of course, given the channel that it is, the question of whether or not we trust science is the question that I'm interested in. Now, of course, most of us don't get to talk to scientists every day. Nevertheless, there are times where we get asked to trust the science by politicians or indeed in the media.
Well, getting back to normal and defeating this pandemic all comes down to a smooth rollout of a vaccine, Ron.
And as you know, Jennifer, state officials face a huge hurdle trying to get people to trust the science. Take a look at this, folks.
There's a really nice paper from 2021 by Sulik et al. That talks about some of the examples in which we've been asked to trust the science, particularly referencing activity through COVID, where we were asked to trust the science, trust the scientists. I'm sure you can all remember the kind of thing that I'm talking about. But if we don't ever really talk to the scientists themselves, then how is it that we get in a position to trust the science? To be really simplistic about it, one of the really natural ways in which we have for building trust is to get to know someone, to find out what makes them tick, to check for ourselves whether or not they're the sorts of people that we're going to trust. And if, as I've just said, we don't get to talk to the scientists very much, then how do we come to trust the science or trust the scientists? It feels like that's going to be a difficult question to answer. And in that case, does it make it really hard to trust the science? Now, one of the glories of living in the 21st century is that there are entire cohorts of people whose job it is to help us with communication with scientists, to help us understand what scientists are doing, what they're getting up to, what's going on in their labs and in their discoveries. And these people are our journalists, our science communicators. Can these people help us then to build trust in the science? Perhaps, but things aren't going to be quite so simple. There's a really thought-provoking article by Schipani in 2024. I'll make sure it's linked down below. And that paper gives some really interesting reflections on some of the challenges that we in fact face in building trust in science by engaging with journalists and engaging with science communicators. And in fact, it looks like there are some structural features of the way in which that kind of activity might be undertaken that will make it quite hard for us to build trust in science. Now, you should absolutely go and check out the paper for yourselves, but here's my take on it. Let's begin with the idea that I think is perfectly sensible, that when scientific communicators or journalists are reporting on what's going on in science, they will report scientific consensus, typically, of course. And so what they'll do is they'll write something like, nearly all scientists think that, or most scientists believe that. Expressions with that kind of form and structure. And that feels entirely sensible, really responsible as a mode of reporting, right? Because nothing's ever completely settled and completely certain. That's one of the challenges of epistemology, that we know that there is always scope for some minimal doubt in anything that gets said. And so reporting in this kind of way, really accurately, 99% of scientists or nearly all scientists or most scientists, claims with those structures just looks super sensible, really like it's responsible journalism and responsible reporting. Okay, so we report consensus. Where is this going? Well, let's consider a case. Indeed, given I've already talked about COVID earlier on in this video, let's have a little bit of a think about what it was like early stages during COVID, when there were conversations going back and forth in the media about whether or not masks would help slow the spread of the disease. In a situation in which there is scientific consensus, it still looks like the journalist is going to be obliged to report the state of that consensus. So rather than getting stuck into actual numbers and actual reporting, let's just make it nice and simple. Let's suppose that we've only got 6 scientists in the world. 3 of the scientists think that wearing masks will help slow the spread of the disease. They've seen the data, they've seen the experiments that have been done, they think it's pretty nailed on. Of the six, we've got three of them who think that. We've got three left. Two of them haven't really seen the data yet. They've got some understanding of disease modelling, perhaps, but they're not quite clued up. And they're pretty neutral on things. They haven't yet had a chance to interrogate things fully. They say, well, we're not sure whether masks will actually help slow the spread of the disease, but we also haven't had a chance to look. The final scientist is a bit of a contrarian and says, oh, actually, I don't think masks will help. In fact, maybe they'll make it worse or something. I don't know. All right, now, suppose that you're a science communicator, you're a really responsible journalist who's faced with that setup. Three scientists who've dug into it who say, yeah, absolutely, masks will help. Two who say, dunno. One who says, no, they won't. You have an obligation to report what scientists think, or at least that was the assumption we were working with. If you've got an obligation to report what the scientists think, you have to report, well, there is disagreement in the scientific community as to whether or not masking will help slow the spread of the disease. And that looks like it's going to be troubling. Troubling not just because this will not enable us to slow the spread of the disease, but also troubling because, and unfortunately the data really bears this out, where we have reported disagreement among the scientists, we're actually doing something that will undermine public perception of trust in science. So in other words, reporting this disagreement actually increases mistrust in science. And from lots of points of view, that really isn't a foolish response on the part of the public. As Schipiani notes, in some sense, the public could be considered really rational to respond like this, to respond in a way that says that they're not building trust in science in this way. After all, the argument might go, one should trust in science only when we've really got a robust consensus. And the kind of 6 scientists, 3, 2, 1 model that I just described doesn't give you that. And so if the public at large is responding in such a way as to say, look, where we've got this reported disagreement, we don't trust the science, we don't trust the scientists as a group because there is this divergence of opinion, that might in some senses be considered a really rational response. What all of that means for us, of course, is that journalists and science communicators who are following what we said was a really responsible practice of reporting on who thinks what in the scientific community might actually be helping to undermine trust in the scientific community. And that feels like a little bit of a head scratcher. Now, happily, in her really excellent paper, Schipiani actually has 3 recommendations for helping build trust in science through revising scientific communication practices, so revising the sorts of things that journalists report. The first of these is a move to what she describes as epistemic responsiveness. And what's crucial here, Schipiani thinks, is ask scientists not just what they think about the world, but ask them to say what it would take for their view to be shown to be false. So, for instance, if you're talking to those scientists about whether or not masks will help slow the spread of COVID, ask them what evidence we would need to have to show their view false. What that will help us to do here, crucially, of course, is to demonstrate to the public, the people who are looking on and reading the scientific communication and so on, that everything in science is responsive to evidence. So you're not just saying, here's my view, you're saying, here's my view, here's what it would take for that view to be false. And of course, there's nothing to stop you from then going on to say, as a good scientist, here's my view, here's what it would take for it to be shown to be false, and actually, here's why that's really unlikely or really improbable. The second of Schipiani's recommendations is to stop reporting on science as a body of knowledge or as a body of theories, and to start reporting on it much more as being a process. And crucially, that's a process that's continually updating in response to the evidence that it has. As she puts it, one is warranted in trusting scientists where they're epistemically responsive, namely where they explain what the best available evidence says and why. Despite some disagreement, the best available evidence says why, therefore one should trust the science on why. So that's her view. Stop treating science as a body of knowledge, a body of fact, and start reflecting on it in the reporting much more as a process that is always updating in response to evidence. And in that way, of course, it doesn't really matter who thinks what about what. We're not reporting consensus, we're reporting the process has led us to the point where we think that masks will help slow the spread of the disease. So that's what we think it shows us. Of course, we're a process-driven way of thinking about the world. We're good scientists, we're responding to evidence. So this is where we've got to, this is what we think. And I guess you can kind of see how that feels like a much more dynamic and engaged way of thinking about science than this static repository of knowledge. Finally, to get the scientists who are speaking about their views to acknowledge the concerns of others, but then to explain why they aren't moved by those concerns. So if we jump back to the COVID example that we've been running with, you're one of those scientists who's seen the data, you're one of the three, you're really close to everything. Important then to indicate that you at least understand where the concerns of the contrarian are coming from. Don't just rubbish them, don't call them names, those sorts of things. Acknowledge the concern where it's coming from, but then explain why you aren't moved by it with reference to the evidence. Of course, that mode of scientific communication, and again, it's the journalists and the scientific communicators who would need to be leading in this because they're the ones who we're reporting. But if we get that kind of structure of discussion going, then again, you're getting that sense of science as an epistemically responsive discipline that says, yes, I see what that concern is, but I'm not moved by it because of these sorts of issues. And that feels like quite a powerful and responsive way of thinking about science. Now, crucially, one of the things that I found really interesting about Schipiani's paper and really quite powerful was that when we're thinking about how to build trust in science, we're actually really not talking about the science at all. What we're talking about is the medium through which we communicate it and thinking about that medium as the thing that helps us build the trust within it. So all of her recommendations around how we report on science are, well, they're exactly that. They're recommendations on how we report about science. So building trust in science actually doesn't require the science or the scientists to be any different. It requires the reporting on them and the discussion we have around them to be changed. And that was a really nice thought, I thought, that was a reflection on trust and how we build it rather than the epistemic practices of science itself. So I thought this was a really cool paper. It's just come out. I don't think I've seen anything in the literature that's responding to it yet. I'd absolutely say go and have a look at it. And it was also really interesting, I thought, to see a philosophy of science communication paper, which I think this is what Schipiani's paper is. There's plenty of work, as many of you will know, in the philosophy of science and indeed the philosophy of lots of different things. Philosophy of physics, philosophy of biology, philosophy of mathematics. There's a philosophy of most things. But I hadn't really seen too much in the way of the philosophy of science communication. And that feels like a domain where philosophers should have quite a lot of work to do, and hopefully work that can be really helpful, just as I think Schipiani's paper is really helpful. So that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to like and subscribe if you think that the philosophy of science communication is a good thing, and also if you don't think that that's a good thing. Until next time, stay suitably trusting.